We want to welcome you to the Core Concepts lectures that are sponsored by one community, the Institute of Applied Metaphysics, the Church of Revelation. And these lectures are being conducted to allow people to get a good idea of different religious disciplines, spiritual disciplines. And we've had a very good crowd. If you've been watching any of the lectures, you will know that to be so. Our guest today is Dr. David Stowell. And Dr. Stowell is a physicist and natural philosopher, worked for years in Washington, D.C., and is now in the Memphis community. And today he's going to be talking about a very unusual man, Rudolf Steiner. And Rudolf Steiner began in the late around 1880, and all the way through his career took him in between World War I and II, when he passed in 1926, I believe, 25 or 26. So we want to welcome Dr. Stowell and his introduction of Rudolf Steiner.
Hi. My set of notes is very short. The first question is, why is anyone interested in Rudolf Steiner? And the answer to that is so long and so complicated we'd never fit it in an hour. But let's start with the end of his life, and what were some of the things that you see in the world around you that are due to Rudolf Steiner. If you're into organic gardening, in 1924 he started an initiative called biodynamic agriculture, which emphasized composting. It was somewhat merged with a gentleman from England in 1945 when Rodell started putting out his magazine on organic gardening. Steiner started the first Waldorf school. The Waldorf schools nowadays, also called the Rudolf Steiner schools, are by far the largest independent school system in the world. They are independent. They are not government controlled. They're not controlled by any particular economic interest. They grew out of his spiritual insights. Other things that he started a branch of medicine called anthroposophic medicine. He created some unusual architecture for his headquarters. He wrote mystery plays. He started a new form of movement called eurythmy. By his death in 1925, he had written some 30 books. He had given over 6,000 lectures, most of which were transcribed verbatim. These lectures are put out in books, usually somewhere between 8 and 14 lectures per book. In addition to the books and the lectures he gave, both public lectures and to his own group, which was initially the Theosophical Society, but later branched off into the Anthroposophical Society. Try practicing that word a few times. It means the wisdom of humanity. Sophia as wisdom, and anthropos as humankind, mankind. 6,000 lectures. In addition, there's other material coming out. There's been his correspondence. There's been the fact that in addition to public lectures and lectures to within his organization, he was running an esoteric school, roughly from 1903 or 4 till 1913. This was initially under the auspices of the Theosophical Society. There were no written records of what was taught there. but various members did write notes afterwards as best they could remember, and a number of these have been compiled, of the basis of his work was what he called spiritual science, and he referred to himself as a spiritual researcher. By spiritual researcher, he meant a number of things, but primarily that he was utilizing the same thought patterns as natural science, as a natural scientist, and he was applying it to spiritual and soul research. Okay, now, out of all this, he has so much material, I still have trouble condensing it down. But basically, anyone who is interested in New Age sort of thinking, spiritual science, religious science of any kind, would be well advised to read Steiner. In fact, you may very well have been reading Steiner without knowing it. He gave a series of talks on esoteric Christianity and Rosicrucian Christianity. And there was a local count that was attending these lectures that emigrated to America and published them under the name of Max Hindell. So some of your writings there may come from him. A lot of his ideas have propagated into the public awareness, one way or another. You may remember in the 80s there was a flurry among the New Age people of angels. Everything was about angels, angelology. Well, Steiner had a few lecture series on the hierarchies of angels, what they did in the natural world, what their impacts were in the creation of the universe effectively, and where they were going. And these books, if you start reading the fine print of a number of the books that came out in the 80s, you'll find Steiner's books referenced there. Usually not big print describing the source in the main part of the text. Steiner was interested in everything, and he was very good at most of the things he turned his hand to. Why was this? Let's take a jump now from the end of his life, a summary of the different accomplishments he had, to the earlier phase. A quick biography. At approximately age 9 or 10, he discovered he was what we would term clairvoyant. He saw a dead relative appear, and he sort of mentioned it, and from the reaction of his parents, he never mentioned seeing ghosts in front of his family again while growing up. He did. He was apparently seeing nature spirits pretty much all the time, and he was much more content, as it were, in his own mind and with the non-physical aspects of the world growing up, and less so with the physical aspects. In fact, part of his growing up process was working to make a solid contact with the physical world and getting some grounding in the fact that what he was seeing that no one else was seeing was real, that it did make sense in the real world. To get that grounding, he charged in learning philosophy. In high school, he cut pages of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason out so he could slip them between the history pages. He discovered that the history teacher was just reading the books, so he slipped the pages in and he would be reading along, but he was actually figuring out what Immanuel Kant was really saying and meaning in the Critique of Pure Reason. Suffice to say that a good part of Steiner's early work was defining the limits of Kant's work, but that's for a bit later. He did graduate from a technical high school. He did have to work his way through college, and he went through a technical college, so he was teaching physics, chemistry, math, Greek, Russian, Greek, Latin, the popular arts, as it were, as a tutor, because he needed the bread to stay alive. He was also teaching accounting, which he taught himself, on and on and on. When he was approximately 17 or 18, he started riding a train with a very interesting gentleman who was an herbist, who apparently also saw natural spirits, and they were able to have wonderful conversations, and apparently this was the first person that Steiner was really able to talk much about what he really saw and was comfortable doing so. This herbist, a couple of 3 years later, introduced him to a person we don't know anything about, called the Master, who was apparently one of the Masters. Steiner referred to them as the Masters of Harmony, Masters of Wisdom and Harmony of Feelings. These were essentially the same sort of breed of masters as the Theosophical Society referred to as being their great teachers. The Steiners happen to be in the Western traditions versus the Eastern traditions. Practically all we know about Steiner's private life is what he wrote, or what very few people around him observed from time to time. Anyway, the Master laid out what he needed to do to progress with real spiritual development. Remember, he was already, as we would term, psychic and clairvoyant, and he was also having to deal with the fact that he loved, say, growing up, the local Catholic ritual and priests, but he was also a bit concerned because he could see that the priests weren't quite believing what they were doing, whereas he was seeing great results from that. Let me jump now. He had about, I would say, 3 to 5 major initiatives as far as explaining how one does spiritual research. What are the limitations of it? What is it good for? Etc., etc. And each of them, I don't think it's fair to say that they are, one is deeper than the other, but they reflected how he was coming at this problem. The earliest one, and I would refer to his first 3 or 4 books on this. The first one was approximately called A World View, was presented by Goethe. Goethe was the famous German poet and dramatist, who was also a scientist of the late 1700s and early 1800s. Steiner spent about a decade being a professional editor of Goethe's scientific writings, and that was published as part of a large volume of collected works of all of Goethe's writings. Goethe, as a scientist, was practically the opposite. He had a different way of thinking and a different approach to scientific problems than the scientists of the time. And this meant that basically by the time Steiner was studying him, he wasn't particularly respected or noted as a scientist. He was noted as a poet and a dramatist and a great literature author. Goethe's approach to natural phenomena was to think about it, to integrate it. He made a number of statements along the lines of if you study nature, nature will reveal her secrets. That you need to study plants, animals, as humans, and some of Goethe's studies were indicated that there were certain bones that we had that were physiologically recognized at the time, very obscure things. His was a very integrated view. The traditional scientists of the time and now is the thinking pattern of take things and break them into smaller and smaller pieces, and then learn about the little pieces and how they go together. Goethe's approach was to look at a specific object and try to integrate it as to how it went together. The prime example of that would have been published in his book, Metamorphosis of the Plant. The idea was that Goethe was looking for what was the underlying thought or underlying idea between all plants. What was it that made a plant a plant? And then from that he branched out to taking his so-called Uber plant, the one fundamental plant. How did that come from out of the world of archetypes or whatever, work into specific instances of plants? Basically, and I probably will not be doing Goethe justice at this point, he had the idea that the mental image, the fundamental idea of the plant is the leaf. That if you put this cosmic leaf in the ground, then it interacts with the ground, becomes root. If it comes out in the air, it tends to grow up and will pull stems out. If this uber leaf is in the desert and interacting with strong sunlight, it tends to get pulled in cactus things. If the same leaf is put in water, it tends to float out. Again, he was trying to get what is this common element that is manifesting, this common element from the world of ideas or archetypes, or in some sense spiritual world, that manifests through all plants. This entire idea of what is the universal idea that is manifesting in specific instances was very, very important to Steiner. And in fact, much of his work is utilizing various forms of this idea. He did feel that, let me jump a minute here. Steiner basically expanded this idea of Goethe. Goethe was successful with the idea of finding a uber plant mentally that he could apply back and forth with specific physical plants to determine how they were working. And of course he went on to the calyx of a plant is a bunch of small leaves, and the blossom is yet a different kind of leaf, and a seed is the leaves collapsed on itself tight, which is then prepared to go back in the ground for the next round as a root, so forth and so forth. And that this life cycle is basically contained in this uber plant. And the essence of this was transformation, as it were. This uber plant was transformed depending on its environment and interactions. Goethe tried the same process on animals. What is it that makes an animal, and on people that made that he was Steiner felt he was unsuccessful on both of those for various reasons. The fundamental of which reason was that was the sort of information that would allow one to think that through was not available on Earth at that time. Now, let's take a jump here to hit. What are you, as in Steiner's view, as a person? Why am I doing this? Because Steiner's philosophy is both concrete and specific, and he claims it's objective. He claims that and feels that the spiritual world and soul world, as in one of his vocabularies of using this, are objective. That practically everything major and much of what's minor comes out of the spirit's world into the soul world and then into the physical world. And what is humankind's position there?
Did he,
Yeah.
what was the differentiation that he made between this coming from the spirit world to the soul world? I mean, what was how was he differentiating that?
Let me duck that by spending a couple minutes on language. Basically, Steiner almost never gave definitions. He felt largely the definitions of soul or spirit things basically became abstract nonsense in most people's listening. He gave descriptions. The one time that I saw him give a definition, he was giving a definition of karma, and he spent 8 pages of descriptions before coming up to his definition. All right, and I really can't do justice to his distinctions. Basically, one of his other things was, if you're doing spiritual soul research, do not be one-sided. And so he would take a specific thing and look at it from this angle and from that angle, from the other, from how did it manifest from the primordial times down through stages of incarnation, how is it influenced by history, how is it influenced by environment, and to the extent I can start, spirit for him was immortal and ubiquitous. We are very close to the spirit in our thinking, which is why his first approach to getting people to become clairvoyant or more aware of the spiritual world was to emphasize thinking. His first major book, titled in English, one of the titles, it has several, Philosophy of Freedom, was also has been titled as Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path, which he had authorized as being a reasonable title for the same work. So spirit is both within us and out there. The world also has soul at various levels. And basically, we can learn to see and act in the spiritual world, but it's a spirit-to-spirit type communication. Soul-to-soul type communication, just as a physical-to-physical, when we talk and see each other. And we're catching different aspects of the same thing with each type of perception. And we have to look at these from the different types of perceptions and then put together. Sort of again like what Goethe was doing and looking at a number of plants and what have they got in common, and instead of doing like Linnaeus and making a long classification of each different plant according to leaf and the stem and so forth, what is it that is all in common? Similarly, to get any aspect of any process around you, anything, takes looking at it from multiple viewpoints. Now, spirit is what is in common. Spirit is very closely aligned to thought. If you take your average thought and press on it till you get the idea behind the thought, and work more to process that idea into an ideal, one is getting to the spiritual world. Both Goethe and Steiner were basically saying that if you open yourself to something, such as a plant or something, and think about it, and pay attention to the thoughts you're getting are not necessarily your thoughts. They are your mental apparatus acting as an instrument to perceive a different aspect of that reality. So in other words, the plants are explaining itself to you, if you wanted to use Cosmides type terms, and it is reflected in your perception as thoughts, ideas, and so forth.
You mentioned earlier that he didn't get much notoriety until he began to speak or work with the Theosophical Society.
Right.
How did he differ with them? Why did he move on? And
all right. That's going to lead us far from what is important, because
Okay.
so far Steiner doesn't think anything that the most important thing is people beginning to think realistically about spiritual and soul level. Now, the ins and outs of the Theosophical thing was in several stages. He was invited to basically living room lecture series by Count Brockendorf, and from that he came out with two books. One of them called Mystics After Modernism in our current vocabulary, the other being Christianity as a Mystical Fact. Again, each of these are worth several hours of topics. He was invited to the London to a meeting at the London Theosophical Society, and was invited to take over the German section of the Theosophical Society. The previous person there had gotten old and sort of retired in the harnesses, as it were. Steiner did so basically on two conditions. Again, he did not join the Theosophical Society, and he said he would speak only of the outcomes of his personal experience. In other words, he was not going to reprocess the words of the masters, or reprocess the Vedas, or the Mahabharata, or the Bhagavad Gita, or so forth. His talks were basically only out of his results. And that was more or less a stand he took throughout his entire career. So in a certain sense, everything in these 6,000 lectures could be said, my experience with this particular aspect of reality. And to a certain extent, he was always trying to get people to follow his thinking, to lead into being able to view that sense of reality. Now, back to soul and spirit. The fact that Steiner pointed out that it's very hard to convey non-physical facts and so forth, because our vocabulary is very much physical based. That basically getting to any of the spiritual facts or soul facts accurately is a matter of metaphor and simile, and expecting the listener to sort of take the hint and go further with it in probing. As a result, Steiner also, not only is he difficult to read in English, he is difficult in his native German, Austrian. Let me give you an example of this. This book, Freedom of Philosophy. Philosophy of freedom, let's get that straight. In German, the word that is translated as freedom is Freiheit. Now, height does not mean dumb. If you think childhood or adulthood, nationhood, now the accurate English translation would be freehood. Now, what does freehood mean to you? The word didn't exist in German, and basically, it is a state of being free, if you want to approximate it that way. And what is the state of being free? That was the point of his book, Philosophy of Freedom, or Freehood, or Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path. At that time, he was working strictly as a philosopher. A good part of the book was explaining where Immanuel Kant was correct and incorrect. He felt that Kant was absolutely correct that as long as you confine your perceptions to the traditional five senses, then there will always be things in the universe you can never know. You can never know the thing in itself, which has been a major impetus both in Kant philosophers and in scientific circles. You know, we don't know the thing in itself, we just know the description, we just know the surface, so forth. Steiner's view was you, the individual, can develop additional powers of perception, soul powers, spiritual powers, etc. And with these additional powers, one can see/understand the thing in itself, not just the physical part. Okay, now let's go back to Goethe again. The flower on the outside and the the idea of the essence of flower on the inside, and matching these two up. That it is the total matchup is where objective reality is, and not doing, oh, it's all, you know, only the physical world exists, nothing else exists, is one erroneous thing that limits you, and you come to Kant's conclusions if you're an honest thinker, because if you start with that premise, you can only go so far. If you take the opposite view of, oh, everything is spirit, everything is spirit, everything is God or love or whatever, people have no idea what that is. It's not concrete. It's so amorphous as to be meaningless or abstract. Or he was always very kind in his words, and when he was even criticizing people, he would say abstract, or and even things that he disagreed with, he would put the best light on it. But basically, that part of being human is right now to split things, as it were, into an outside part and an inside part. The inside part we perceive as the thought or idea behind it, or another part of the inside part is what is the emotion or feeling that is evoked by a pretty rose, or the color green, or the color red, or so forth, and that these are in fact a perception, or a beginning of a perception, as much as what we see with our eyeballs, which, when you think about it, we think everything is out here, but in fact, physically thinking, it's all pictures way in here. Maya, illusion. Anyway, so his entire spiritual teaching, among other things, was don't be one-sided. Consider things from all aspects. Consider that the feeling aspect that is evoked by something in process, and the thinking aspect is, or the idea aspect, is a part of that reality out there. How do we know what a tree is? How do we know what a table is? What is the tableness of table? What is the treeness of tree? They look all sorts of different ways, but there's something there that is common. And he sort of was pushing that this is, in some sense, an idea, or archetypal idea.
Was that his major, do you think that's his major contribution, was the philosophical, the metaphysical, Steiner, as opposed to all the other things that he did, because he's so broad?
Let's play again, Goethe, a root, stem, leaves, calyx, flowers, fresh seeds. This is the root in his beginning path to sort out spiritual insight. And it is basically. I would like to jump back a minute before answering that question to what is man, or what is human. Basically, Steiner says that he is the most complex being on the planet, composed of one physical part that we see, three superphysical parts that we don't see but are active within us, and then some additional spiritual parts beyond those that have not yet incarnated physically. To a certain, and he has, depending on which viewpoint he was taking, he would describe these as physical body, etheric body, which he emphasized was not the ether of the physicist, but he also called at times the body of formative forces, the astral body, which is in a lot of ways similar to what the Theosophical Society considers the body of emotions, desires, passions, and then what he called the I organization, which is in one sense a personality, and in another sense what is a certain amount of unconscious things that go on to maintain us as an I. All right. In terms of how these things relate to the outside world, the mineral world, rocks, are basically physical only at this level. Plants are physical plus etheric, and etheric is, among other things, the body things, heredity, the transformations of light, of different shapes and different situations. Um, the astral or astral body, again, is basically animals have a physical body, an etheric body, because they have life. Everything that has life has an etheric body within it, as opposed to hovering around it or shaping it from the outside. Animals have an astral body as well. They move, they perceive, they have sensations, which he claims that plants don't have. And then mankind also has what he calls the I organization, which is an awareness of I, a feeling of separateness, and a necessary thing for our present incarnations and so forth. Basically all of these are tied in with the entire evolution of the universe, the entire evolution of mankind, all right, on and on. But anyway, that's sort of the touching point at which you start getting a feeling for which is your etheric body, which is the astral body. What is going on here? In terms of life processes, in our eternal part, our spiritual part, we reincarnate. The average person might spend 50 to 70 years typically here between birth and death, and then he spent a lot of time on what happens in the period of life between death and rebirth. He has several lecture series on that, especially during World War I, when people were getting slaughtered and people living were wondering, what does this mean, what is happening, so forth. That, in point of fact, the period of time after death, again, he divides into a fairly lengthy path. Basically, as you leave different aspects of this earth experience behind, and then various aspects of all earth experience behind, where they continue to be worked on by the effectively angels and reprocessed, as it were, that you go up to higher and higher levels of knowledge and spiritual beings, and then eventually you start planning what is your next lifetime going to be like, and with a lot of inputs from other spiritual beings, you come back down with your plans, with the fact that you have been working, as it were, in some cases for generations in advance. For instance, picking your parents, so you've got a huge, potentially long process coming back down, and as you come back down, you gain what the transformed mind, transformed emotions, transformed talents, and so forth that you get packaged with as you come down and get reborn. And basically, as you come down, you're losing intelligence all the way down, but you're gaining the other parts, that the so-called, as the theosophists say, the sheaths of yourself, the different bodies.
Have you found any writers that parallel him? He seems so, Emerson wrote essays on nature, but have you found anybody else that was in the same league or that would parallel him in any way?
It depends on how you want to answer that. The basic answer is that in his view, all of the great spiritual writings, all of the great religious writings, come from so-called initiates, those who have become clairvoyant and see into the spiritual world, and have brought this wisdom down, put it in a form suitable for the times, that humanity has always had guidance from the spiritual worlds of various forms, that in the early days everyone was clairvoyant, as it were, could see into the spiritual world, see nature spirits, but were relatively not awake, more like waking dream type consciousness. So you had all sorts of spirits and or superphysical beings of greater or lesser capacity, in the brooks and the trees and the sky and the clouds and the thunder and the sun and the planets, etc., etc. You also had, and some of these were powerful, were called gods, and he identifies some of them with various levels of the archangels or angelic hierarchy. Let me be specific, since there's 9 of them. That basically, as we got more proficient and adapt on the physical world, we were losing our connection, direct connection to the spiritual world. Basically most of what he said, he felt was very much in keeping with with all of the world's spiritual teachers as they applied at the time. That again, the goal was spiritual and soul insight into superphysical things as well as physical things. Basically, the depth of materialism, he said, happened about in the region of 1850 or so, and the world is pulling itself back out of materialism. That basically, with the plunge into materialism, our consciousness is far brighter, far more adept than it was previously. Not too many of us wander around dreamy all the time. On the other hand, the less we thought about the spiritual world, the less we became involved with it. Basically, we went through this stage of having only dreams of gods or life after death, and then we went through the stage of only the initiates really had the information. We had Christ coming to earth in a large-scale passion play, as it were, that basically what he acted on a historical basis was one of the visions, was one of the common visions out of the spiritual worlds that the initiates would see and were looking for. All right, this is, we're going much too deeply here to have this hold together. Anyway, basically we came to a time in which basically no one, not even the initiates, for a few years could see into the spiritual world, and then basically new procedures for reclaiming skills in the spiritual world were and are being developed and put out. That previously we were given our previous clairvoyant facilities as gifts developed, as it were, out of the spiritual world, that are working back into the spiritual world has got to be activity that we do. In other words, it's our responsibility now to reawaken these things. And he goes into a lot of technical details as to different chakras, different petals of chakras, different exercises for getting different ones of them going, as it were. But the important things now are that we are thinking in terms of spiritual soul world as being part of as being here as well, that we be strengthening our internal soul, our internal spirit. A lot of the old techniques, he feels, are no longer applicable. And when he says no longer applicable, he's thinking in terms of, well, these things take, a few thousand years to change over from one state to another. So there are plenty of people. There are some people with old-style clairvoyance, but they don't fit terribly well. There's some with the new style, and they're working ahead of the curve. And most of humanity is coming along in a long, spread-out process. Basically, the older techniques, largely because the internal soul and spirit were relatively weaker, had a number of techniques that involved weakening the physical body so that the soul perceptions and spiritual perceptions would be visible. I mean, and you could think of fasting or drugs or going off in a cave or all these things. And to some extent these work, but you only get as far as the old clairvoyance with them. That the modern approach is to strengthen your powers of soul and your powers of spirit and powers of soul, include thinking and objectivity, truth, etc., and powers of feeling, so that these things that feel fairly weak become stronger, as it were, so that they become as bright in our consciousness as our physical sight and hearing, and that this is basically the long-term path that he's working on.
Toward the end of his life, he was living in a very tough time in there between World War I and World War II, and already things, there was a lot of upheaval, and I think his school was burned, and there was a pretty horrible time in there.
Yes. He spoke a lot on World War I, both during it and afterwards. He closed the esoteric school at the outbreak of the war, saying that this is no time for any secret societies. And when he reformed his group, he said this is all public. Anyone can come in for any reason, as long as they're willing to want to make honest efforts or honest research. Basically, there was a huge amount of social concern on the so-called social question. The social question before World War I was how do we integrate commodity-based production into society, which was again a part of the people moving off the farm and working in factories. And how do you do this? This is a task for humanity. Did I mention that when we were born here, we have our own jobs? We have the jobs we have to do as part of common humanity. We have the jobs we have to do based on our social status, where we're born. If not jobs, at least opportunities or tasks that we should be performing. So what we want is only one aspect of what we come here bundled prepared to deal with. World War I was a breaking point in a lot of things, including he viewed in the spiritual world, that certain things had to be dealt with very forthwithly. Consequently, as World War I ended, he got a request of what can we do to make society work so we don't have another world war. Now Steiner had, if you read things, occasionally he'd mention occult laws that he was operating under. Again, whether you believe them or not depends on what you pre-believe, as it were. One of them was that he could only answer questions that people asked him. In other words, he could not take initiative in introducing something new into the world. If someone asked him, is it possible to do a Christian-based esotericism, which Marie Shriver did in 1901 or 2, then he could open up on Christianity. Some would ask him the question, how can we make a society that works? And oddly enough, this was a fairly high-ranking members of the German government. So he spent a couple, 3 weeks laying out what he called the threefold solution, which was that you did not want to have a centralized society. The society needed to have 3 separate, autonomous but independent parts, that then it would reflect people's soul organization properly. That any attempt to have a central government that was in charge of the economics and in charge of what he called the spiritual, but he included all cultural activities, was doomed to catastrophe. He put out his ideas, he pushed them for 2 or 3 years. He had a list of 144 or so intellectuals signing a petition saying these are great ideas. He got them circulated, he had them in books, he explained them in greater and less detail. It got him a lot of people unhappy with him also. Everyone who had a vested interest of any kind was against a independent autonomous society and against a independent autonomous responsible individuals. Basically it increased his visibility greatly in the world, so people were listening more to his ideas, people were coming with more questions for him, and out of this, the Waldorf school came about because one factory owner said, "Will you start a school for us?" based on some thoughts he had put out 14 years earlier. Doctors came to him and said, "How can we do medicine and healing better?" So he gave some classes on doctors. Ministers came to him and said, "How do we do a religious revival? What is necessary? How can we do this?" So he gave courses on religion and on pastoral medicine, and basically Riddlemeyer, who was a major Lutheran minister, split off and made what he called the Christian community. With Steiner's advice, that Steiner was not involved with it. He felt, this is a good thing, but my path is bringing spiritual insight into these ongoing processes to make them better, not to get involved in one particular one. He had a fight within his organization, as it were, the Anthroposophical Society, because it was getting so prolific with society, with school. People wanted to be teachers, or people wanted to go off and be part of the Christian community, or they wanted to go off and be part of this activity or that activity, that they were, again, separating and specializing themselves. So he had a number of lectures on, look, this is coming about because of the connection with raw anthroposophy. You get the connection from the spiritual and soul world, and insights flow into creativity, into making things better. If you get locked into one or the other to the point where you're cutting off the flow, this is one of the problems of humanity right now at all levels. This was what he was against at all levels. Anyway, I think I've about used the time, and I still haven't gotten terribly far into it. But
we'll have to do it again because it's too big a subject.
Yeah.
Could you give the viewers contact numbers or how they might get more information on Rudolf Steiner and so forth?
all right. Rudolf Steiner, the primary source, of course, is the Anthroposophical Society of America. They're located in Ann Arbor. I became a member last year, so I'm still feeling my way into it. I've been reading Rudolf Steiner for about 12 years now. they do have a number of contacts into everything else connected with Rudolf Steiner. There are separate Steiner-related activities, as the basically Waldorf school system has their website and their connections. The biodynamic agriculture people have their connections and their insights. The anthroposophical medicine also has their website and connections. Having talked with some of these people, some of them are very supportive of the basic anthroposophical society, and some of them are basically doing what Steiner said of oh, I've got this wonderful piece and it works, you know, and you guys over there are wasting my time with all this other stuff. And you know, some of these individuals, in fact, have a very solid spiritual understanding and are growing in that direction, and others are using it as an excuse to close themselves off.
And if they would like to ask you personally something before going into that, is there an email address you can share with them?
I can give you an email address. I am very, very slow with emails for a variety of reasons, especially if you ask a good question. You know, a good question. Steiner would answer a good question with perhaps a lecture cycle of 10 hours or so, because that's really what it takes, unless you're going to give some superficial slapdash answer, and that is the last thing we need. You can try me at DAVESTO, Dave Stowe, at millkern, MILLKERN-com, -period.com, and do mention your connection with where you've heard me or talked with me or seen this, so that I know where you're coming from, and I won't be scratching my head of, gee, is this another person whose name I've forgotten already? Anyway.
We want to thank Dave for Stowell, Dr. Stowell, for being with us today. We want to thank you for being with us at the Core Concepts Lectures.